Well, welcome to the ADI session in the conference. Probably I don't need to uh, do all this introductory remark because we all know each other very well. But I just like to at least introduce the presenters and the discussions today. Then we will start. Well, these two research papers are the outcome of the Asia Development Institute's research project on fragile state. So today we present these two papers, and the first presenter will be Katoka Ben. Professor Ben Katoka is at the Hankuk University of International Studies. And the second paper will be presented by Dr. Lee Soo-yeon. She is a research fellow at the Asia Development Institute. And I'm sorry that I'm chairing these sessions, but I'm also the co-author of these two papers. And today we have a very good discussant, Professor Jo Minhyo, Seongkyungan University. Thank you for coming. And second discussant is Professor Yang Yun-jung. She's also Hankuk University of International Studies. So,
sorry, International Foreign Studies, Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, HUFS in short. Thank you.
So, well, just one thing is that this fragile state research is the core research project at the Asia Development Institute. I think this research is in a way very important because the Korea is now OECD DANG member with 10 years experience. So this issue is as a mature donor, we need to tackle the issue of fragile state. So as a basis of the public policy, the Asia Development Institutes have worked on these fragile state issues. So without further ado, I'd like to ask presenters start for 20 minutes, 25 minutes each. Then I will give 10 or 15 minutes for discussions. So we'll have enough time for discussant to give a full comment. Then after that, maybe 5 minutes or 5 minutes from the presenters to respond to the comment. So I like to ask Professor Ben Katoka first to present the paper on the building the state capacity of fragile state in Sub-Saharan Africa, a paradox of New Deal and foreign aid. So you have 25 minutes.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the nice introduction and, of course, the opportunity to present this paper today. So I have divided my presentation into 8 sections, 8 long sections. But the last one is just for supplemental information in case you need more information about, for example, the data. So in the first section, I will briefly introduce the context. One is what are fragile states, but of course, I believe that I will not have to spend much time on this because I believe that you already know what fragile states are. But then I will talk about what the New Deal is about and why is it important. And next, I will talk about the introduction, about the contribution of the study, and briefly talk about the previous studies related to aid delivery in fragile states. And then I will talk about the analytical approach and the results, and then conclude with the result, the concluding remarks. So then what is the New Deal for engagement in fragile state? Very briefly, the New Deal is like a key international framework for addressing the development challenges in fragile state. So very importantly, the New Deal proposes what is known as the peace building and state building goals. And among these state building goals, we have, for example, the goal of helping fragile states to build their capabilities to to collect and manage public revenue and to deliver public services effectively. So in order to achieve these goals, the New Deal tried to find new ways for donors to engage in fragile states. Among these new ways, the New Deal stresses the collaboration between donors and recipient government. So it is about, strengthening the collaboration, such as, for example, delivering aid directly to recipient government instead of relying on non-state development actors. So the goal of this study basically is about evaluating the impact of the New Deal, whether the New Deal has been able to help donors to effectively deliver aid through government channels, for example. So we use the synthetic control method, which was introduced in 2003 and 2010. And there are recent developments, for example, the study by Abadier in 2015, and the most recent one, which is called the penalized synthetic control method. And the paper was published, I believe, this year, 21. Right, so we're using this approach to analyze whether the way that donors deliver aid to fragile state has changed since the adoption of the New Deal for engagement in fragile state. So previously, there are some similar studies, and those studies basically look at how aid is delivered in fragile states. And here I just highlight some of the conclusions from these studies. For example, that donors, in general, they tend to deliver aid through non-state development actors, such as NGOs. That is the main point, right? But so far, there has been no study that have looked at the impact of the New Deal. And I think this study is somehow a good contribution to the literature. I think I shared the paper, and there is an extensive discussion of the previous papers related to aid delivery in fragile state. I'm just wondering if the participants have access to the paper. But here I want to talk very briefly about the methodology, about the analytical approach. First of all, about the outcome. Here I like to mention that aid is delivered through many channels. For example, donors rely on public sector, for example, by delivering aid directly to government, such as by providing budget support to recipient government. The other channels include the NGOs and civil society, international organization, public-private partnership, and so on. So in this study, I have divided these different channels into two categories. The first category is what I call the government-to-government aid, and I call it PSO to make it simple. And the other category is called bypass. However, since there is no data, like time series data on the other channels, the study focused on the public sector ODA only. So in other words, we are looking at whether donors have delivered more aid directly to recipient government in fragile states. So the data on ODA is taken from the OECD. I think this database provides accurate data on aid for more than 200 countries, I guess. And the study covers 44 Sub-Saharan African countries for the period between 2005 and 2019. And about the classification of fragile state, I think this is very important to talk about this. As you know, there are many classifications of fragile state. For example, the World Bank list. The OECD also has a list based on an annual report that it publishes annually. And there are many other organizations that also propose a different classification of fragile state. But in this study, we choose to focus on the OECD classification. That is number one. And we also classify countries as fragile based on their formal membership to the G7 plus organization. So the G7 plus organization is like an organization of the countries that recognize themselves as fragile. And most of them are in Africa, but there are also countries in Asia, such as Timor-Leste and Afghanistan, for example. So based on the OECD classification, we classify a country as fragile if it has been classified by the OECD as fragile for at least 8 of the 12 available reports between 2005 and 2018. And countries are classified as non-fragile if they have been classified for less than 5 times, like less than 5 reports of the OECD. All right, so then about the synthetic control method, as I said, the approach was introduced in 2003, and it is about the comparison of an outcome of interest. So in this case, we are looking at aid that is delivered through the recipient government. I call it PSO. Right, so it is about comparing this outcome between the treated unit, and here the treated unit is fragile state as a group or as individual countries, and a control group. In this case, the control group is formed of non-fragile states. All right, so the basic idea with this approach is to look at the difference in the trend of the outcome of interest before and after a time cut off. So here, as you know, the New Deal was adopted in South Korea in December 2011, but we consider that because it was adopted in December 2011, maybe it makes more sense to allow a year, that is 2012, for donors to adjust their policies in order to change their behavior towards a fragile state. So we consider the year 2013 as the time cutoff. So that is the implementation of the New Deal recommendations started in 2013. So then the intuition here is to compare the trend in the outcome, which is the ODA delivered to the public sector before the New Deal and after or since the adoption of the New Deal. So what we expect is that before the New Deal, the treated unit and the control unit should be similar in terms of the outcome of interest and also in terms of all the variables that affect that outcome of interest. Right, so we compare, it's like the approach is similar to matching. So the treated units are matched with similar untreated units. And in this case, the untreated unit, as I said, are the non-fragile states. So based on the past values of the outcome of interest and the past values of the other covariates or the other factors that may affect that outcome of interest, we think that the treated and control unit should be similar before the New Deal. But then after the New Deal, if the New Deal has a positive impact, we should evaluate that impact in terms of the gap in this trend, the two trends here between the treated and the untreated unit. So if the New Deal has a positive effect, we should expect the trend for the fragile state to be like this solid black line here, while that of the non-fragile state should be like the dashed red line here. And so, as I say, the outcome of interest is the PSO, but we also consider all the variables that may affect that outcome of interest. So among those factors, we include poverty rate, such as the proportion of people living under 1.90 US dollars a day. Why do we consider this as important? We think it is important because maybe, you know, that period between 2000 and 2015, we had the Millennium Development Goals. So it is possible, for example, that donors supported countries based on their performance in poverty reduction, for example, such as if a country performs well in terms of poverty reduction, then donors maybe in a way to support such government, they would provide more aid through their public institutions or through their public systems. And the other covariate is the civic and political freedom. And we also consider the number of deaths from natural resources and others, as you can see here. And here I also like to highlight an important covariate, which I call the share of UK and US aid in total ODA. Why do we consider this as an important determinant of PSO? Well, the intuition is that countries that receive more aid from the UK and US tend to see more aid flowing through non-state development actors such as NGOs. So in comparison to other donors such as France and Germany, those two other donors, France and Germany, tend to deliver more aid through the government system. But here, to avoid collinearity, we just focus on the UK and US aid, and we include it as a continuous variable in percentage, like a percentage of UK and US aid in the total bilateral ODA that the country receives annually. And based on the recommendation of Abadie, like the original synthetic control method, we also consider past value or past realizations of the outcome of interest. And we consider values of the PSO for the years 2005, 7, 9, and 11. So based on all these covariates, we consider fragile states and we compare them with the non-fragile state that resemble the fragile state on this covariate here. So then we have a challenge. The challenge is that originally the synthetic control method was introduced in the context of a single treated unit. But here we in our context, we have 23 fragile states, meaning 23 treated units. So according to the original synthetic control method, the way to deal with this context is to create an aggregate treated unit. So how do we do this? We create an individual treated unit based on the average of all the fragile states. And then after creating that aggregate treated unit, we compare it to the control unit composed of the non-fragile state. So after doing this, we also do the synthetic control method for individual fragile states. But here in this graph, in the first panel, we do the synthetic control method based on the aggregate treated unit for the 23 fragile states. So the aggregate treated unit is based on the 23 fragile states. And the panel B is based on the aggregate treated unit based on, here the sample of fragile state is restricted to the fragile state members of the G7 plus organization. So what we observe Number one is that you can see that the treated unit and the synthetic controls, they somehow match. So this is quite good, I believe. But when we look at the trend after the New Deal, we don't see any change. So this means that there is no effect. So the New Deal did not affect the aid delivery in fragile state. But when we restrict the sample of fragile state to the G7 plus organization, we observe that in fact, the period following the New Deal witnessed a decrease in the flow of ODA delivered through public systems in fragile state. So to put it differently, it means that the New Deal had a negative effect on aid delivery in fragile state. So a negative impact of the New Deal is shown in this graph here. But now, is this effect significant? The way to measure the significance of the effect are many, and the synthetic control method originally proposed many ways to measure or to check the robustness of the result. And what we did here is that we dropped from the sample of control unit all the countries that contributed to create these two figures. So the intuition is to see whether some countries or a few countries influence the result. And the results are shown in this appendix. You can see that the results are not so much different, even if we change the sample. So we observed that the New Deal did not have an effect on aid delivery if we consider 23 fragile states in Africa. But if we restrict the sample of fragile state to the G7 plus countries, the trends are quite similar, and we observe this drop here in terms of the PSO for the fragile state. So this indicates again that the New Deal did not have a positive effect on the aid delivery for fragile states. So in order to confirm this result, we also estimated panel data. So we used many approaches, including simple difference in differences, and also random effect with time-fixed effect to see whether these results are similar. And here we use a probit model in which we create an outcome variable based on the threshold value of the outcome variable. For example, in column 1, the outcome of interest here is equal to 1 if the amount of ODA delivered through the public sector represent at least 60% of the total ODA, right? And here the threshold is below 40%. And this part is based on the sample of 23 fragile states. And in panel B here, the sample is restricted to the fragile state members of the G7 plus organization. So what we observe is that the interaction term between fragility, like the status of fragility, and the period after the New Deal, so this is equal to the difference in differences estimate, as the intuition is the same. Yeah. And what we observe, the panel is based on the period between 2005 and 2019, and it is based on annual data. And we can observe that the coefficients are not significant, meaning that the New Deal did not have an effect on the New Deal. But when it comes to the trends, I mean, the trend in ODA delivery in the non-fragile state, which is represented by this coefficient here, we see that it is significant, meaning that for the non-fragile state, the period after the New Deal saw an increase in the likelihood of receiving higher amount of aid to the public sector. And apart from this, we also see that the civil and political liberties and the share of ODA from the UK and US are also significant for the, you see in the 4 columns that the coefficients are significant. So what this means basically is that, number one, countries that receive larger shares of ODA from the UK and US and those with restricted political and civil liberties, they are more likely to receive lower proportion of ODA through the public sector. But when it comes to the New Deal itself, the effect is absolutely insignificant in general. But we see also some negative sign here indicating a negative effect, although it is not significant. So as I said, we also considered synthetic control method for individual fragile states, and the results are quite similar, that the New Deal did not have a positive effect on aid delivery, but at the same time, there are significant differences across fragile states. So then what explains these differences is perhaps a subject of another paper. And perhaps during the Q&A session, I will have to talk a little bit more about these differences. So to conclude, the New Deal, according to our findings, the New Deal did not change the way that donors deliver aid to a fragile state. And when we restrict the sample of fragile states to the G7 plus countries, so to put it differently, the G7 plus countries are the most fragile countries. So they are the chronically fragile countries in Africa. So then it means that in those very fragile countries, donors deliver less proportion of aid to the public sector. And of course, as I said, there is also significant differences across fragile states. And perhaps finally, in some fragile states where the US and UK are the main donors, the New Deal resulted in less ODA being delivered through the public sector. So in other words, being a large recipient of the UK and US is associated with even lower amount of aid delivered to the public sector. And apart from this, we also have that political restrictions in fragile states also contribute to the proportion of aid that is delivered through the public sector in fragile states. So I think I will stop here, and perhaps I will talk about more details during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we are going to move to discussions of discussant. So I'd like to ask first Professor Jo to comment Ben Katoka's paper.
Yes, thank you.
10 minutes?
10 minutes?
10, 15 minutes.
I don't think I'll be that long, but thank you for inviting me to be the discussant for this very interesting paper. I'll be honest, I'm not an expert on ODA, but I am an expert on evaluation. And luckily, Ben's paper is an evaluation of an ODA policy on the effect of, it's an evaluation of a policy. So just to summarize, Ben did a great job of presenting the paper. So the paper is very, very technically sophisticated. It implements a multiple set of quantitative methods to examine whether there was a change in donor country behavior in providing foreign aid to fragile states following the framework of New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, agreed upon at the 4th High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness in Busan, Korea. Now, the authors put in a great amount of effort to try to make accurate comparisons in the effect of the New Deal on fragile and conflict-affected states versus non-fragile states, using the first synthetic control method, and second, using a weighted interrupted time series analysis method. Now, I guess because in a sense, this is a program evaluation, and the program being the New Deal, it suffers from the very common concerns that any policy evaluation does, which is the problem of bias emerging when we don't use an adequate set of comparison groups to estimate the counterfactual outcome. Now, here in this paper by Professor Kwon and Professor Katoka, they implement this method called the synthetic control method to estimate the counterfactual outcome. And honestly, in the beginning, I wasn't familiar with this method, but I quickly noticed that it's actually very similar to the propensity score matching method. And as Ben said, it's a matching scheme. And so because this was a highly technical paper, my comments, so I'm going to give you 4 comments about technical quantitative methods. And then I'll ask you just give you some general comments about the overall, I think, content of the paper. So as Ben mentioned in the presentation, this is very similar to the matching scheme, where so it's similar in the sense that the synthetic control method and matching, they share the common intuition that not all comparison units are similar to the treated units. And if you use a comparison unit that's actually quite different from the treated, then it suffers from severe bias. And so therefore, we need to statistically create suitable comparison units for each treated unit through a weighting scheme and reduce bias. Now, in the present SCM analysis, the synthetic control method analysis, the comparison units are drawn from the non-fragile states, and the treated units are the fragile states as well as the G7 plus member fragile states. Naturally, the synthetic control units should be more comparable to the treated units, and only using these matched units, not using the whole comparison units, but only using the matched, the weighted, basically, the weighted comparison group should improve our estimation in the treatment effects. However, I guess my first question now comes regarding the quality then of the synthetic control units. Specifically in the paper, as I was reading in tables 3 and 4, both tables. So table 3 uses the entire fragile states sample, and table 4 uses the G7 plus member states. So they're basically the same. One can see that some of the covariate characteristics that you use for matching become more different from the aggregate fragile states and the synthetic aggregate sample as compared to just the entire non-fragile state comparison group. For example, specifically, in table 3, the variable proportion of ODA from UK and US was 32.91 in all non-fragile states. And it was 33.54 in all treated units, the aggregate fragile states. However, it becomes 49.44 when we look at the synthetic aggregate fragile states. So this is quite counterintuitive because we're doing matching to create a sample that looks more similar to the treated unit, but as a result, one of the covariates becomes more different. Now, I know probably what happened was the weights that were created probably gave more weight to a certain country or maybe a couple of countries that had a high proportion of ODA coming from UK and US, and probably this is what resulted. However, this implies that the synthetic control analysis created a weighting scheme that increased the difference in this specific variable between the synthetic controls and the treated units. And so this is actually not a good thing. Similarly, we can find this tendency also in table 4 for the same variable proportion of ODA from UK and US. and population growth too. So there are two variables that are becoming more different using the synthetic control. Now, normally, so I use propensity score matching a lot. I've used it a lot. And so typically in propensity score matching, to prevent this from happening, we do a balancing test before we calculate the weight. So before the estimation of weights can occur, usually you would expect conducting t-tests for each covariate that you are controlling for across the synthetic control units and the treated units, and only allow the weights to be estimated when the combination of synthetic control units delivers a set where the differences are no longer statistically significant across all of the variables after you apply the weight. And so this is the balancing test that we call in propensity score matching. And that's why propensity score matching can be very excruciatingly painful, because it all comes down to specifying the model to allow balancing across all the variables. Now, what that means is, in very practical terms, usually you have to include a lot of interaction terms between the covariates. You also a lot of times have to include squares and cubes of certain variables. So basically, you know how in the drawing, in the figures, the whole model of synthetic control is in the pre-New Deal period, you're trying to create a model specification that perfectly fits, right? And then with that model, you're going to predict what happened after the New Deal. So in order to get the model fit perfectly strong and accurate in the pre-New Deal period, you're willing to include all these like interaction terms and quadratic and cube terms to improve the model, basically R square, really high. And for me, in my dissertation thesis, it took me like 3-4 days non-sleep going through all these crazy variable combinations. But so Ben, I think you should try to look a little more deeply for the specification. Next, I'm going to move on to my second comment in terms of how you're estimating then the pre-New Deal period model. You're using that model to predict what happened after the New Deal. I guess in the paper, it's worth mentioning, because this is a question I had, are there any other external factors that could have occurred after the New Deal, after 2013, that may have influenced the fragile states and the non-fragile states in a systematically different way? I ask this because 2013 to 2019, the post-New Deal period, is a quite long time. And I know there were a lot of probably international agreements and policies that may have been affecting the states. Now, if it was just a random shock, it doesn't matter. But if it systematically affected fragile states more or less in a certain way versus non-fragile states, that could bias your results, because your model is based on pre-2013 data. So I think you should mention that in the paper. My third comment is, and Ben, you mentioned this in the presentation, that the original synthetic control method, and by the way, Abedi, who wrote the paper for the synthetic control, actually is basically he created kind of the propensity score method too. So this is kind of a very similar method. But anyway, so the original SCM is for a single treated unit, right? So the idea, the real intuition is you have a single treated unit and you're trying to create an artificial comparison unit for this one unit using a weighting scheme. Now, because in your paper, you don't do that, actually, you create an aggregate of all the treated units and you do a synthetic control. Now, theoretically, I understand what you did, but then my question is, from a practical standpoint, how are you going to interpret this finding? I say this because this is kind of like a hybrid, non-existent fragile state, right? It's an average of everything. Now, it doesn't really exist. So then in terms of policy implications, I guess, we can't really consider the nuanced context of each treated country. And in ODA, as we know, every country context is so different, very unique, that highly influences the donor decision. And so I guess this aggregate composite that we did, statistically, theoretically, it makes sense. But from a practical standpoint, I think you need to think about that. My final comment talks about your results in the individual treated units, where you use So basically using the SCM, the synthetic control method, is inappropriate because it yields poor pre-treatment fits for many of the individual countries. And so that's probably why you aggregated them. And so you implement the interrupted time series analysis regression. Again, this is a very highly technical method. I applaud to you. A lot of painstaking work. Now, I guess my question is, the weights that you use to construct the panel data set here, it comes probably from the aggregate sample, doesn't it? I mean, the aggregate analysis. I guess I'm wondering, did the weights that you apply here for the creation of the panel data set, did it come from individual country analysis, or does it come from the aggregate country analysis? Because I think only it would make sense if it comes from the individual country analysis weights. I just wanted to, it's a clarifying question, I would say. And then the second comment is, I believe it would be useful if you would include some figures using estimation results from the ITSA to compare, because the strength of ITSA is, the difference between DID and ITSA is, you can actually visualize baseline and the trend of ODA very accurately because it actually measures it with the betas. And so I think you could probably show us that as a figure. So my comments about the method is done here. And I thought this is a really interesting paper. I guess because this is such a highly technical, sophisticated paper, you don't have much time to really discuss the substantive meanings of your findings. And so I guess I was kind of really curious as, you know, for example, what kind of mechanism could have preceded for this result to happen? Because basically you found that the New Deal was not effective, especially for UK and US donors. It really just didn't make any difference. And for some of the really fragile states, it got even worse. So this is the typical evaluation mechanism problem question. What's the black box? What happened? Why are we seeing this? I think you said that that's a future project, and I completely agree in that. And then my final comment is, there's a lot of heterogeneity in your findings across countries that is really not emphasized and highlighted enough in the paper. However, given that results vary so much by these fragile states, I think it would be really interesting to explore these differences and identify the main characteristics that drove the donors to really differentiate their behavior. Okay, thank you. It was a great paper, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you spent 15 minutes. Well, but
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
No problem. We really appreciate your comment. I'd like to invite Ben first to respond to the comment from Professor Cho. Probably we couldn't respond these all comment. I think these comments are all very useful, but response to selectively, especially this critical and important one. So Ben, please, you first. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, and thank you, Professor Young, for this very important comment. One can tell that they come from an expert. Right. So here I noted 5 comments. I will answer to some of them. The first one is about the similarity between the synthetic control method and propensity score matching. And on this, you highlight the fact that the quality of the treatment fit is not so high. That it's quite poor, and that is very important. And I acknowledge this point in the paper. And the original synthetic control method proposes some ways to improve the quality of the fit, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit. One is to restrict the donor pool or the sample of control unit to units that are similar to the treated unit. But as I mentioned it in the paper, that would be similar to comparing fragile state to other fragile state, but that is not the goal of our paper. The goal of our paper is to compare fragile states to the non-fragile states. And the other way to improve the quality of the fit is to increase the data period. So the paper is based on the period from 2005 to 2019. So if we follow this recommendation, we should increase the data period to, let's say, at least 20 years before the New Deal, but this is practically impossible to implement given the quality of the data before 2005. So we limit our data period to 2005. And about the alternative explanation to the outcome after the New Deal, whether there are other explanations to aid delivery after the New Deal. Well, I think that's very difficult to answer. And one of the assumptions of the synthetic control method, and also an assumption, a very strong assumption of the difference in differences, is the what is called the common shock assumption. This means that other phenomena occurring at the same time or after the implementation of the policy should affect the outcome of the treated and the control unit equally. So that's a very strong assumption, and the synthetic control method also builds on that assumption. But whether it makes sense, it's quite difficult to answer. But in a way, we use the panel data to see whether the trend after the adoption of the New Deal is different in the treated and control unit by including the time fixed effect. So in the panel data, we include the time fixed effect and control for this common shock after the implementation of the New Deal. And using the panel data, we found that the New Deal did not have an effect. And about the interpretation of the result based on the aggregated treated unit, the intuition, as I said, is to create a treated unit that is based on the aggregation of many treated units. So according to the original synthetic control method, the interpretation should be the same, because this aggregate treated unit is equal to a single treated unit. But perhaps we should be careful in terms of how we interpret. And in the paper, we say that the treated unit represent the average of the fragile state. I think that's what we do in the paper. And about the fact that there is no enough discussion of the result, I think that makes sense, because we're preparing the paper for submission to a journal, and with the space constraint, we didn't have enough space to discuss all the results, but we did our best to at least highlight the most important points. And perhaps finally about the individual countries, I think you asked whether the panel data set used for the interrupted time series is created from the aggregate synthetic control method or from the individual. The panel data set is actually created from the individual synthetic control method. So what we did is to exclude all the countries that did not contribute to any of the synthetic control method. So we have 23 individual synthetic control methods. So for each of these 23, we exclude all the countries that did not contribute to construct the synthetic control method. So we had, I think, 4 or 5 countries excluded from the sample, and then we created a sample with the countries that contributed to the synthetic control plus the treated unit, and then we estimate individual interrupted time series for the individual 23 treated units. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much again, Professor Yang, for your comments.